In suburban San Diego, a 68-year-old widow was about to face the most devastating betrayal of her retirement years. What started as ordinary babysitting took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter-in-law's venomous tongue. Editha Jones wasn't your typical grandmother. For 5 years, she had quietly sacrificed $180,000 of her inheritance, known for her selfless generosity. When Jessica called her useless after a childcare mishap, Editha had no idea this moment would shatter everything. Her silent response would lead to consequences that exposed the toxic reality of financial dependency and changed their family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crayon broke in Tyler's fist, sending fragments of burnt orange across Editha's carefully waxed kitchen table. At 4 years old, he possessed the singular ability to transform any peaceful moment into chaos, and this Tuesday afternoon was proving no exception. "I want Mommy!" Tyler's wail pierced through the suburban quiet of Michael and Jessica's rental house, his face contorting into that particular shade of red that preceded an epic meltdown. "I want Mommy now!" Editha Jones, 68 and steadily losing the battle against her grandson's tantrum, bent down to gather the crayon pieces. Her knees protested, a daily reminder that her body wasn't built for chasing toddlers anymore. "Sweetie, Mommy will be home soon. Why don't we work on your drawing? You were making such a beautiful sun." But Tyler was beyond reason now, his small body rigid, with the injustice of being 4 years old in a world that didn't immediately bend to his will. He swept his arm across the table, sending crayons cascading to the floor like colorful confetti. 7-year-old Sophie looked up from her homework with the weary expression of a child who'd grown up mediating adult emotions. "Tyler, stop it. You're making Grandma sad." But Tyler was in full meltdown mode, his cries echoing off the kitchen walls. Editha felt that familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times over the past 5 years, whenever family chaos threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She'd been watching the children since noon, when Jessica's dental office called in a panic about a scheduling mix-up. No childcare backup plan, of course. There never was. Just an expectation that Grandma Editha would drop everything: her volunteer work at the library, her afternoon with Betty, her rare moments of solitude, to step in whenever life got complicated. Which, in Jessica and Michael's household, was practically every day. The house around her bore witness to their struggles. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink, their surfaces filming over with the residue of yesterday's meals. Bills carpeted the kitchen counter in various stages of urgency, some still in envelopes, others marked with red stamps that shouted "Final Notice" in bureaucratic fury. The refrigerator hummed with the labored effort of a machine held together by prayer and electrical tape. Editha had been paying for most of those bills for 3 years now. The mortgage, the utilities, even groceries when money got particularly tight. Jessica never asked nicely. Demands came wrapped in passive-aggressive comments about how some people had it easier, how retirement must be nice while others struggled to make ends meet. Tyler's screaming reached a new octave, and Editha realized she'd been standing frozen in the chaos, crayon fragments cutting into her palm. She set them carefully on the counter and knelt beside her grandson, her voice taking on the gentle authority she'd perfected during 30 years as a school secretary. "Tyler, honey, look at me." She waited until his tear-filled eyes met hers. "I know you miss Mommy. She's working hard to take care of you and Sophie. But right now you have me, and I love you very much." Something in her tone penetrated his distress. The wailing subsided to hiccuping sobs, though his bottom lip still trembled with the effort of containing his emotions. Sophie abandoned her math homework entirely, sliding off her chair to wrap her thin arms around Tyler's shoulders. "It's okay, Ty. Remember what Grandma always says? Family takes care of family." The words hit Editha like a physical blow. How many times had she said that? How often had she justified her endless giving with that simple phrase? Watching it become gospel in her granddaughter's developing worldview. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the kitchen windows. Jessica's arrival was always announced by noise, keys jangling, bags dropping, sighs heavy enough to fill the room with her exhaustion and frustration. "Mom!" Sophie called out, her face brightening with relief. "We're in the kitchen." Jessica appeared in the doorway, still wearing her dental hygienist scrubs and the particular brand of frazzled irritation that came from dealing with other people's problems all day. Her dark hair had escaped its ponytail in wisps that framed her face, and her brown eyes swept the scene with immediate judgment. "What's wrong with Tyler?" The question came out as an accusation, as if Editha had personally orchestrated her grandson's emotional breakdown. "He's been missing you," Editha said carefully, rising from her knees with more effort than she'd like to admit. "We had a little spill with the crayons, but Jesus, look at this mess." Jessica's voice carried the sharp edge that always preceded an explosion. "I work an 8-hour shift, and I come home to chaos. The dishes are still in the sink, dinner's not even started, and Tyler's having a meltdown." Editha felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "I was watching the children, Jessica. I didn't have time to." "You didn't have time?" Jessica's laugh held no humor. "What exactly do you have time for? You're retired. You literally have all day to what?" The words came out sharper than Editha intended. "To clean your house? To raise your children? To be your unpaid housekeeper?" The kitchen fell silent except for Tyler's sniffling. Sophie's eyes darted between the two women with the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival. Jessica's face flushed red. "Unpaid? Are you kidding me? You think watching your own grandchildren is some kind of job? It is when I do it 5 days a week while you work, Jessica. It is when I rearrange my entire life around your schedule, without so much as a thank you." "Thank you?" Jessica's voice rose to match Tyler's earlier pitch. "For what? For sitting around my house all day? For being useless except as a glorified babysitter?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Useless? Editha felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Some essential support beam that had been holding up years of patient endurance simply snapped. "You know what, Jessica?" Editha's voice became eerily calm, the way it used to when particularly difficult parents challenged her authority at the school office. "You're absolutely right. I am useless. So perhaps I should find something better to do with my time." She walked to the counter where her purse sat beside the pile of unpaid bills. Bills she'd been planning to take care of tomorrow, as she had for the past 3 years. Bills that represented car payments and mortgage installments, and utility fees that kept this household running, while Jessica worked part-time, and Michael struggled to find steady freelance work. The mortgage payment alone was $2,400 a month. Add utilities, groceries, car insurance, and the children's activities, and Editha was contributing nearly $4,000 monthly to keep this family afloat. Money that came from her late husband Robert's pension and the inheritance that was supposed to fund her own retirement. She picked up her purse with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Sophie watched her with wide eyes, sensing something momentous in the air. "Grandma." Sophie's voice was small, uncertain. "I love you both very much," Editha said, bending to kiss Sophie's forehead and ruffle Tyler's hair. "Always remember that." Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, her earlier fury replaced by something that might have been confusion, or the first stirring of alarm. "Where are you going?" Jessica demanded. "You can't just leave. Michael won't be home for 2 hours, and I haven't even started dinner." Editha straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of dignity she'd forgotten she possessed. "I'm going home, Jessica. To my own house. To figure out what useful things I might do with my remaining years." She walked past her daughter-in-law without another word, past the chaos of the kitchen and the stack of bills that tomorrow would become someone else's problem. The front door closed behind her with a quiet click that somehow felt more final than Jessica's earlier slam. The drive to her own house took 12 minutes through the familiar streets of suburban San Diego. 12 minutes of carefully maintained composure while her mind replayed the last 5 years of quiet service, unacknowledged sacrifice, and gradual erosion of her own sense of worth. Her ranch house sat peaceful and orderly on its quarter-acre lot, the garden she and Robert had planted 30 years ago still blooming despite her recent neglect. The automatic sprinkler system kept everything green and lush. One of the many home improvements Robert's pension afforded her. Improvements that Michael's family took for granted while struggling to keep their own rented house from falling apart. Editha sat in her driveway for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through her passenger window, she could see the stack of Michael's bills she'd picked up from his mailbox yesterday. Utilities, credit cards, the ever-present mortgage statement that would bounce if she didn't transfer money by Friday. $180,000. That's what her careful record showed she'd spent over the past 5 years, keeping Michael's family afloat. Nearly her entire inheritance from Robert's life insurance, plus substantial chunks of both their pensions. Money that had disappeared into the black hole of their financial irresponsibility without so much as an acknowledgement, let alone gratitude. She thought of Robert, who'd worked 42 years at the defense contractor to build their security, who'd scrimped and saved and planned so carefully for their retirement together, who'd died believing their money would give Editha comfort and independence in her later years. Instead, she'd become the family's silent ATM. Useful only for the regular deposits that kept Michael and Jessica's lives running smoothly while they treated her like an inconvenient burden. Useless. The word echoed in her mind as she finally gathered the energy to walk to her front door. But as her key turned in the lock, Editha realized Jessica had gotten one thing wrong. She wasn't useless. She'd simply been useful to the wrong people, in the wrong ways, for far too long. That was going to change. The house felt different in the silence. Editha stood in her pristine entryway, her hand still gripping the door handle as if she might flee back to the chaos she'd just escaped. But there was nowhere to run from the echo of Jessica's voice, from the word that had carved itself into her consciousness like a brand. Useless. She set her purse on the mahogany side table, the one Robert had refinished himself during their second year in California, and walked through rooms that suddenly felt foreign despite 3 decades of careful tending. Everything was exactly as she'd left it this morning. The Persian rug centered perfectly beneath the coffee table, the throw pillows arranged just so on the cream-colored sofa, the family photographs arranged in careful clusters on every surface. Photographs that told the story of a life built on service to others. In the kitchen, she filled the electric kettle with water, her hands moving through the familiar ritual while her mind churned. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window above the sink, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Even here, in her sanctuary, she could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her shoulders. The kettle's click seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. While the water heated, Editha found herself drawn to the guest bedroom that had become her unofficial office. Robert's old desk sat beneath the window, its surface buried under 5 years of careful record-keeping. Bank statements, receipts, transfer confirmations, a paper trail of financial hemorrhaging that she'd documented with the methodical precision of a woman trained to account for every penny. She pulled out the bottom drawer and withdrew the manila folder marked Michael's Family, 2020 to 2025. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, though whether from anger or exhaustion she couldn't say. The first page was a spreadsheet she'd created after Robert's death, when she'd decided to help Michael through his temporary difficulties. Mortgage payments, $2,400 monthly. Utilities, averaging $340. Car payment, $485. Insurance, $290. The numbers marched down the page in neat columns, each one representing a choice to put her son's family's needs above her own financial security. January 2020, $3,200. February 2020, $3,500. Tyler's emergency room visit. March 2020, $2,950. The pattern continued, month after month, year after year. Some months higher when unexpected expenses arose: medical bills, car repairs, Sophie's school field trips. Never lower, because there was always something. Editha pulled out her calculator, the same basic model she'd used for 30 years at Lincoln Elementary. Her fingers moved automatically across the familiar keys, adding up 5 years of selfless giving. The final number glowed on the small digital display: $179,847. She stared at the figure until her eyes blurred. Nearly $180,000. Robert's life insurance payout had been $150,000. Their combined savings had been another $75,000. Her monthly pension was $2,800. Robert's was $1,900. She'd spent more than their entire life savings keeping Michael's family afloat. The kettle whistled from the kitchen, its shrill cry cutting through her calculations. She ignored it, turning instead to the 8x10 photograph that sat in its silver frame on the corner of the desk. Robert smiled back at her, his weathered face creased with the laugh lines that had deepened over their 43 years of marriage. The photo was from their last anniversary dinner, just 4 months before the cancer diagnosis that would steal him away. He wore the navy blazer she'd bought him for Christmas, and his eyes held that particular warmth he reserved for moments when he felt truly content. "What would you say about this, honey?" she whispered to the photograph. "What would you think about me giving away everything we worked for?" The silence stretched between them, filled only by the kettle's persistent whistle. But in her mind she could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. "Edie, you've got the biggest heart of anyone I know. But sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people learn to stand on their own." He'd said those exact words to her once, when she'd wanted to pay for Michael's wedding, after his credit was declined for the venue deposit. Robert had prevailed then, insisting their son find another way. The wedding had been smaller, simpler, but Michael had managed it himself. And he'd been proud of what he'd accomplished. When had she stopped listening to Robert's wisdom? The kettle's whistle became unbearable. Editha rose and walked to the kitchen, turning off the burner with a sharp twist. The sudden silence felt profound, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She didn't make tea. Instead, she found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden she and Robert had planted together. The roses were blooming despite her recent neglect, deep red Mr. Lincoln varieties that Robert had chosen because they reminded him of Nebraska sunsets. The automatic sprinkler system kept everything green, another small luxury that her financial stability afforded. Financial stability that was rapidly disappearing into the black hole of Michael's household. Her cell phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. A text from Michael. "Mom, Jessica told me what happened. Can we talk? I'm sorry she was rude. As if casual cruelty could be dismissed with such a mild term. Another buzz. "The mortgage payment is due Friday. Can you transfer the usual amount?" There it was. No acknowledgement of 5 years of sacrifice. No recognition that his mother had been keeping his family housed and fed, while he struggled to find steady work. Just the expectation that money would appear in his account as it always had, like magic or divine intervention. The usual amount. $2,400 that came from her pension, her inheritance, her carefully guarded retirement funds. Money that Robert had earned through 4 decades of getting up at 5:30 a.m. and coming home exhausted. Money that was supposed to ensure her independence and dignity in her final years. Instead, it had become the price of feeling needed, of maintaining her role as the family's savior. But what kind of salvation required her to diminish herself? Editha set the phone aside without responding and walked back to Robert's desk. The checkbook for their joint account, now just her account, sat beside the calculator. She'd written so many checks to Michael over the years that his name appeared on multiple carbon copies, a litany of financial enabling. She opened the checkbook to a fresh page and stared at the blank lines. For the first time in 5 years, she left them empty. Instead, she reached for the phone and dialed the number for Pacific Coast Credit Union, where she and Robert had banked for 30 years. The automated system guided her through the maze of options until she reached a human voice. "Mrs. Jones, how nice to hear from you. How can I help you today?" Sarah Martinez had been handling Editha's accounts for a decade. She knew about the regular transfers to Michael, had even streamlined the process to make it automatic. "Hello, Sarah. I need to cancel all automatic transfers to my son's accounts, effective immediately." A pause. "Oh, is there a problem with the accounts?" "No problem. I'm just making some changes to how I manage my finances." "Of course. I'll need to verify some information with you, and then I can stop all recurring transfers. Will you want to restart them at a later date?" Editha looked again at Robert's photograph, at the pride in his eyes when he'd worked for everything they owned. "No, Sarah. I don't think I will." The process took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to dismantle 5 years of financial enabling. When it was finished, Editha felt strangely hollow, as if she'd surgically removed a vital organ. But she also felt something else. Something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. Relief. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Jessica. "I don't know what your problem is, but Michael needs that money by Friday or we lose the house." The threat was clear. Pay up, or watch your grandchildren become homeless. It was emotional blackmail wrapped in maternal concern, and Editha recognized it for exactly what it was. She thought of Sophie's bright smile, of Tyler's sticky hugs. She thought of all the times she'd justified her giving by telling herself it was for them, for their stability and security. But what kind of security was built on the financial destruction of someone else? What kind of stability required a grandmother to sacrifice her own future? The children deserved better than parents who used them as leverage. Editha pulled out a sheet of her personal stationery, cream-colored paper, with her monogram embossed in navy blue, a gift from Robert on their last anniversary. She uncapped her fountain pen, another anniversary gift, and began to write. "Dear Michael and Jessica, after much consideration, I have decided to discontinue my financial support of your household. This decision is effective immediately. I have loved you both and have tried to help you through difficult times. However, I have come to realize that my assistance has not helped you become more independent, but rather has enabled a dependency that serves no one well. I will always love Sophie and Tyler, and I hope to maintain a relationship with them that is based on mutual affection rather than financial obligation. I wish you both success in managing your own affairs. With love, Editha." She read the letter 3 times, searching for any trace of anger or bitterness. There was none. The words were calm, measured, final. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a matching envelope, addressing it in her careful script. Tomorrow she would deliver it personally. Tonight, she would sleep in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by the life she and Robert had built together. She would not lie awake worrying about Michael's mortgage payment, or Jessica's reaction, or the children's inevitable confusion. For the first time in 5 years, Editha Jones would sleep as a woman who belonged to herself. Outside her window, the automatic sprinklers whispered to life, nurturing the garden she and Robert had planted with their own hands. The roses would bloom whether she worried about them or not. Some things, she was learning, were strong enough to thrive without constant tending. Some things needed to learn that strength. The letter sat on her kitchen counter like a bridge she had yet to cross. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict, reactions she couldn't control. But tonight, for the first time since Robert's death, Editha felt like the woman he had fallen in love with 43 years ago in a small Nebraska town, independent, dignified, and nobody's fool. The letters sat untouched on Editha's kitchen counter for exactly 14 hours and 37 minutes. She'd placed it there before bed, its cream envelope catching the moonlight that streamed through her kitchen window. In the morning, she'd awakened with the strange sensation that the world had shifted slightly on its axis while she slept. For the first time in 3 years, she'd slept through the night without waking at 3 a.m. to worry about Michael's family finances. The letter seemed to pulse with potential energy as she sipped her morning coffee. Real coffee from freshly ground beans, not the instant variety she'd been buying to save money for Michael's household expenses. She'd forgotten how much better the real thing tasted. At precisely 9:15 a.m., she drove the familiar route to Michael's house, the envelope resting on the passenger seat like a passenger with something urgent to say. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of San Diego day that reminded her why she and Robert had chosen to build their life here. Palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze, and the mountains stood sharp against a cloudless sky. She didn't knock. After 5 years of constant presence in their lives, she still had a key, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually needed to use it. "With what money?" Jessica's laugh bordered on hysteria. "We're already 3 weeks behind on everything. The mortgage, the car payment, Tyler's daycare. Your mother has destroyed us." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, her face wearing the careful neutrality of a child who'd learned to read the emotional weather. She'd been quieter than usual lately, more watchful, as if she were studying the adults around her for clues about how to navigate this new reality. "Is everything okay, Mommy?" "Everything's fine, baby," Jessica lied automatically, though her voice carried all the conviction of a weather forecaster predicting sunshine during a hurricane. "Go brush your teeth." But Sophie didn't move, her 7-year-old eyes fixed on the notice in her mother's hands with an intensity that made both adults uncomfortable. "Is that a letter about money?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Michael and Jessica exchanged a look that communicated volumes. How much had their daughter absorbed about their financial crisis? How much of their adult panic had seeped into her young consciousness? "It's just grown-up stuff," Michael said, taking the notice from Jessica's hands and folding it quickly. "Nothing for you to worry about." Sophie's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of disappointment, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the adults in her life were no longer reliable sources of truth. She left for school without another word. The power was shut off at 2:17 p.m. on Friday, while Jessica was at work and Michael was at home trying to finish a logo design for a client who'd been paying in installments, when he paid it all. The house fell silent, with an abruptness that was almost violent. No humming refrigerator, no background murmur of the air conditioning, no electronic heartbeat of modern life. Just silence, and the slow realization that they'd crossed another line from which there might be no return. Michael called Jessica at the dental office, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's done. The power's off." "Jesus!" He could hear her struggling to maintain her professional composure. Is there anything we can do? I'd need $430 for the past due amount, plus a deposit. They want cash. $430 might as well have been $4,000. Their checking account held exactly $47.13, enough for maybe 2 days of groceries if they shopped carefully. "I'll figure something out," Jessica said, though they both knew she was lying. That evening, they sat in their dark kitchen eating peanut butter sandwiches by candlelight, like some twisted Norman Rockwell painting. Sophie had accepted the explanation that the power company was fixing something with the same careful neutrality she'd been displaying all week. Tyler thought it was an adventure, clapping his hands at the dancing shadows cast by the candles. "It's like camping," he announced, his 4-year-old enthusiasm a sharp contrast to the grim silence of his parents. Sophie said nothing, but Michael caught her watching them with those two knowing eyes. She was keeping score, he realized, cataloging the lies and evasions, building a mental database of adult failures. The refrigerator began to warm. The frozen food started their inevitable transformation into expensive waste. The house, without air conditioning, began to feel like a slowly heating oven. At 9 p.m., Jessica made the call she'd sworn she'd never make. Her father answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the gravelly caution of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected phone calls. "Frank Williams." "Daddy?" The word came out smaller than she'd intended, carrying echoes of the 12-year-old girl who'd watched him pack his bags and disappear into a life that didn't include her. The silence stretched so long she wondered if the line had gone dead. "Jessica?" "Yeah, it's me." "Christ. It's been, 10 years? 12? Something like that." She closed her eyes, hating how much this call was costing her pride. "Look, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't. We're in trouble, Daddy. Real trouble." Another silence. Then, "What kind of trouble?" The story came out in fragments. Michael's unemployment, Editha's withdrawal of support, the mounting bills, the power cut off, the children asking questions she couldn't answer. With each detail, Jessica felt herself shrinking back into the frightened child who'd begged her father not to leave. When she finished, Frank's breathing was the only sound on the line. "Where's your husband in all this?" "He's trying, he really is. But the work is inconsistent and we've been relying on his mother for so long." "Relying?" Frank's voice carried a note she couldn't quite identify. That's what we're calling it? The criticism stung, partly because it echoed Editha's words, and partly because Jessica suspected it was accurate. We didn't have a choice. You weren't exactly around to help when things got tough. Number I wasn't. The admission came without defensiveness, which somehow made it worse. But I'm here now, if you want me to be. Jessica's throat tightened. I don't know if I want that. But you need it. Yeah, we need it. Give me your address. I'll be there tomorrow. After she hung up, Jessica sat in the dark kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of their collapsed life. Unpaid bills, empty food containers, the accumulated debris of dreams deferred and responsibilities shirked. Michael found her there an hour later, tears streaming down her face in the candlelight. Hey, he said softly, sitting beside her. It's going to be okay. Is it? Because I just called my father, the man who abandoned us when I was 12, to ask for money. That's where we are, Michael. That's how far we've fallen. It's temporary. Is it? She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the candle flames like tiny fires. Because I'm starting to think your mother was right. I'm starting to think we've been living in a fantasy, and now reality is catching up. Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled away. I had a panic attack today, he said quietly, at the client meeting. Right in the middle of presenting the logo concepts. Just started hyperventilating and had to excuse myself. Did you get the job? They said they'd be in touch. Which meant no, but neither of them needed to say it. We can't keep doing this, Jessica whispered. We can't keep falling apart in front of the kids. Sophie's already asking too many questions. And Tyler? God, Tyler still thinks this is all some kind of game. What do you want me to do? I want you to fix it. I want you to be a man who can take care of his family without relying on his mother or my deadbeat father. I want you to fight for us instead of just accepting defeat. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Michael stared at the candle flame, watching the wax pool and solidify, thinking about how easy it was to melt under pressure and how hard it was to maintain your shape once the heat got turned up. I'm scared, he admitted. So am I. But being scared is a luxury we can't afford anymore. Upstairs, Sophie lay in her bed, listening to her parents' whispered conversation through the heating vents. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. Fear. Desperation. The sound of adults who'd lost their way and didn't know how to find it again. She thought about her grandmother's house, with its automatic sprinklers and perfectly arranged rooms. She thought about the way Grandma Editha used to hug her, like she was precious and fragile and worth protecting. Now Grandma was gone, and everything was falling apart. Sophie pulled her blanket over her head and made a wish on the first star she could see through her bedroom window. She wished for things to go back to the way they were before, when adults were strong and problems got solved and love didn't have a price tag attached. But even at 7, Sophie was beginning to understand that some wishes were too big for stars to handle. Frank Williams arrived at 10:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning, driving a pickup truck that had seen better decades but still ran with the stubborn reliability of American steel. The engine's rumble announced his presence before Jessica could see him through the kitchen window, and something about that sound, deep, masculine, and utterly foreign to their quiet suburban street, made her stomach clench with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She hadn't seen her father in 13 years. The last time had been at her high school graduation, where he'd appeared unannounced in the back of the auditorium, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit, and disappearing before she could decide whether to approach him or pretend she hadn't noticed. He'd left a card on her windshield afterward, a generic congratulations message with a $100 bill tucked inside and no return address. Now he stood on her front porch, holding a battered leather suitcase and looking like a man who'd spent the last decade rebuilding himself from the ground up. His hair had gone completely gray, and his face carried the weathered lines of someone who worked with his hands under an unforgiving sun. But his eyes, the same brown eyes Jessica remembered from childhood, held something new. Something that might have been regret. "Hello, Jessie." The old nickname hit her like a physical blow. No one had called her Jessie since he'd left. She'd buried that name along with the little girl who used to wait by the window for a father who never came home. Frank. She couldn't bring herself to say Daddy again, not in daylight, not face to face. They stared at each other through the screen door, two strangers connected by blood and separated by years of accumulated hurt. Behind her, she could hear Michael's footsteps on the stairs, moving with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a potentially explosive situation. "Can I come in?" Jessica hesitated. Letting him through the door felt like crossing a bridge she'd burned years ago, acknowledging that her pride was less important than her children's immediate needs. "The power's off," she said, as if this might deter him. "I figured as much from your call." Frank's voice carried no judgment, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd lived through his own disasters. "That's why I brought cash." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick with bills. Jessica stared at it as if it were a live snake. "How much?" "Enough to get your power back on. Enough to catch up on the mortgage. Enough to buy some breathing room while we figure out the rest." "We?" Something shifted in Frank's expression, a vulnerability that transformed his weathered features into something almost familiar. "If you'll let me. If there's any chance you might let me try to be the father I should have been." Before Jessica could respond, Tyler came barreling down the stairs, his 4-year-old energy undiminished by their household's crisis. He stopped short when he saw the stranger on the porch, his small head tilting with curiosity. "Who's that, Mommy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. How did you explain 13 years of absence to a child who'd never known he had a grandfather? How did you introduce someone who'd forfeited the right to be called family? "This is Frank," Jessica said carefully. He's my father." Tyler's eyes widened with the wonder of a child discovering that adults had parents too. "You have a daddy?" "Yes, baby, I have a daddy." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, moving with the cautious grace of someone who'd learned to assess situations before committing to them. Her eyes fixed on Frank with an intensity that made the adults uncomfortable. "Are you the grandfather we never met?" she asked with the devastating directness that only children could manage. Frank's composure cracked slightly. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm the grandfather you never met." "Why didn't we meet you before?" The question hit the porch like a bomb. Michael stepped forward, finally reaching his wife's side, his presence offering moral support, if not practical solutions. Frank looked directly at Sophie, treating her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I made some very bad choices when your mommy was young. I left when I should have stayed, and I stayed away when I should have come back." "Did you say sorry?" "Not until now." Sophie considered this with the philosophical gravity of a 7-year-old. "Mommy says sorry is important, but fixing things is more important. Your mommy is very smart. Are you here to fix things?" Frank's eyes moved from Sophie to Jessica, carrying a weight of hope that was almost painful to witness. "I'm here to try." An hour later, they sat around Jessica's kitchen table, still without power, but with the promise of its restoration. Frank had made the call to the electric company, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. Payment arrangements were made, deposits negotiated, service restoration scheduled for Monday morning. Tyler had claimed the chair closest to Frank, fascinated by this new adult who smelled like motor oil and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who chose his words carefully. Sophie maintained her watchful distance, studying their unexpected guest with the intensity of a scientist observing a new species. "The mortgage is the real problem," Michael said, his voice carrying the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been running financial calculations in his head for weeks. "We're almost a month behind, and the late fees are—" "How much?" Frank's question was direct, businesslike. $3,600 to bring it current. Frank nodded as if this figure was no more significant than the cost of a cup of coffee. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a checkbook, an actual paper checkbook, the kind most people had abandoned for digital banking. "I'll need the account information." Jessica watched her father write the check with steady hands, his penmanship reflecting the careful precision of someone who'd learned to read blueprints and engineering specifications. The sight triggered a memory. Frank teaching her to write her name in cursive when she was 6, his large hand guiding her smaller one across the paper. She'd forgotten that memory until this moment. "Why?" she asked quietly. "After all these years, why now?" Frank set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Because I got sober. Because I realized that running away from problems doesn't make them disappear. It just passes them on to the next generation. Because I have grandchildren I've never met, and a daughter who had to call a stranger for help because the people who should have been there for her weren't. I'm not a charity case. Number, you're my daughter. And these are my grandchildren, and I'm tired of being the kind of man who walks away when things get difficult." Tyler, who'd been quietly coloring with the crayons Sophie had shared, looked up from his drawing. "Are you going to live with us now?" "I don't know yet, buddy. That depends on your mom and dad." "I think you should," Tyler announced with the certainty of someone who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with good intentions. "We have a couch." Frank's smile was the first genuine expression Jessica had seen from him all day. "Thank you. That's very generous." "Tyler," Sophie said with the patient tone of an older sister, "you can't just invite people to live with us. It's more complicated than that." "Why?" The question sparked a family discussion that revealed more about their dysfunction than any therapy session could have. Sophie explained, with the wisdom of someone forced to become an adult too early, that some grown-ups needed time to figure out if they liked each other. Tyler argued that liking people was easy. You just had to be nice to them. Michael contributed the observation that sometimes nice wasn't enough, and Jessica found herself defending her father to her own children despite her lingering resentment. By afternoon, an uneasy truce had been established. Frank would stay for a few days, sleeping on the couch and helping with immediate financial emergencies, while everyone decided how to navigate this unexpected reunion. He'd already made calls about the car payment and arranged to cover Tyler's daycare fees for the month. But even as their most pressing financial problems were being addressed, Jessica felt a different kind of anxiety building. The relief of having help was overshadowed by the fear of becoming dependent on yet another person's generosity. She'd traded one financial benefactor for another, and the weight of obligation felt just as heavy regardless of its source. Meanwhile, across town, Editha sat in her own kitchen, unaware that her former role as family savior had been transferred to someone else. She was reading a book, something she hadn't had time for in years, when her phone rang. Betty's voice carried the particular tone of someone bearing complicated news. "Editha, honey, I just saw Frank Williams at the bank, Jessica's father. He was asking about wire transfers and cashier's checks. Seemed to be handling some significant transactions." Editha closed her book carefully, processing this information. How significant? Significant enough that the bank manager came out to personally handle his business, and he was asking about properties in the area. Rentals, specifically. The implications settled over Editha like a heavy blanket. Frank's arrival meant her financial withdrawal hadn't created the crisis she'd expected. Instead of forcing Michael and Jessica to confront their dependency, she'd simply triggered the arrival of a different enabler. "Well," she said quietly, "that's interesting. Are you okay with this?" Editha considered the question. Was she okay with Frank Williams stepping into the role she'd vacated? Did it matter that her son's family had found another source of financial rescue? "I suppose we'll see what happens next," she said finally. But as she hung up the phone, Editha realized that Frank's arrival had created a new dynamic she hadn't anticipated. The question was no longer whether Michael and Jessica could survive without her support. The question was whether they could learn to respect the support they received, regardless of its source. And whether Frank Williams was prepared for the particular brand of entitlement he'd just inherited. Frank Williams arrived at 10:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning, driving a pickup truck that had seen better decades but still ran with the stubborn reliability of American steel. The engine's rumble announced his presence before Jessica could see him through the kitchen window, and something about that sound, deep, masculine, and utterly foreign to their quiet suburban street, made her stomach clench with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She hadn't seen her father in 13 years. The last time had been at her high school graduation, where he'd appeared unannounced in the back of the auditorium, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit and disappearing before she could decide whether to approach him or pretend she hadn't noticed. He'd left a card on her windshield afterward, a generic congratulations message, with a $100 bill tucked inside and no return address. Now he stood on her front porch, holding a battered leather suitcase and looking like a man who'd spent the last decade rebuilding himself from the ground up. His hair had gone completely gray, and his face carried the weathered lines of someone who worked with his hands under an unforgiving sun. But his eyes, the same brown eyes Jessica remembered from childhood, held something new, something that might have been regret. "Hello, Jessie." The old nickname hit her like a physical blow. No one had called her Jessie since he'd left. She'd buried that name along with the little girl who used to wait by the window for a father who never came home, Frank. She couldn't bring herself to say Daddy again. Not in daylight, not face to face. They stared at each other through the screen door, two strangers connected by blood and separated by years of accumulated hurt. Behind her, she could hear Michael's footsteps on the stairs, moving with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a potentially explosive situation. "Can I come in?" Jessica hesitated. Letting him through the door felt like crossing a bridge she'd burned years ago, acknowledging that her pride was less important than her children's immediate needs. "The power's off," she said, as if this might deter him. "I figured as much from your call." Frank's voice carried no judgment, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd lived through his own disasters. "That's why I brought cash." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick with bills. Jessica stared at it, as if it were a live snake. "How much?" "Enough to get your power back on, enough to catch up on the mortgage, enough to buy some breathing room while we figure out the rest." "We?" Something shifted in Frank's expression, a vulnerability that transformed his weathered features into something almost familiar. "If you'll let me. If you think. If there's any chance you might let me try to be the father I should have been." Before Jessica could respond, Tyler came barreling down the stairs, his 4-year-old energy undiminished by their household's crisis. He stopped short when he saw the stranger on the porch, his small head tilting with curiosity. "Who's that, Mommy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. How did you explain 13 years of absence to a child who'd never known he had a grandfather? How did you introduce someone who'd forfeited the right to be called family? "This is Frank," Jessica said carefully. He's my father." Tyler's eyes widened with the wonder of a child discovering that adults had parents too. "You have a daddy?" "Yes, baby, I have a daddy." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, moving with the cautious grace of someone who'd learned to assess situations before committing to them. Her eyes fixed on Frank with an intensity that made the adults uncomfortable. "Are you the grandfather we never met?" she asked with the devastating directness that only children could manage. Frank's composure cracked slightly. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'm the grandfather you never met." "Why didn't we meet you before?" The question hit the porch like a bomb. Michael stepped forward, finally reaching his wife's side, his presence offering moral support if not practical solutions. Frank looked directly at Sophie, treating her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I made some very bad choices when your mommy was young. I left when I should have stayed, and I stayed away when I should have come back." "Did you say sorry?" "Not until now." Sophie considered this with the philosophical gravity of a 7-year-old. "Mommy says sorry is important, but fixing things is more important. Your mommy is very smart. Are you here to fix things?" Frank's eyes moved from Sophie to Jessica, carrying a weight of hope that was almost painful to witness. "I'm here to try." An hour later, they sat around Jessica's kitchen table, still without power, but with the promise of its restoration. Frank had made the call to the electric company, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. Payment arrangements were made, deposits negotiated, service restoration scheduled for Monday morning. Tyler had claimed the chair closest to Frank, fascinated by this new adult who smelled like motor oil and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who chose his words carefully. Sophie maintained her watchful distance, studying their unexpected guest with the intensity of a scientist observing a new species. "The mortgage is the real problem," Michael said, his voice carrying the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been running financial calculations in his head for weeks. "We're almost a month behind, and the late fees are—" "How much?" Frank's question was direct, businesslike. $3,600 to bring it current. Frank nodded, as if this figure was no more significant than the cost of a cup of coffee. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a checkbook. An actual paper checkbook, the kind most people had abandoned for digital banking. "I'll need the account information." Jessica watched her father write the check with steady hands, his penmanship reflecting the careful precision of someone who'd learned to read blueprints and engineering specifications. The sight triggered a memory. Frank teaching her to write her name in cursive when she was 6, his large hand guiding her smaller one across the paper. She'd forgotten that memory until this moment. "Why?" she asked quietly. "After all these years, why now?" Frank set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Because I got sober. Because I realized that running away from problems doesn't make them disappear. It just passes them on to the next generation. Because I have grandchildren I've never met, and a daughter who had to call a stranger for help because the people who should have been there for her weren't. I'm not a charity case. You're my daughter. And these are my grandchildren. And I'm tired of being the kind of man who walks away when things get difficult." Tyler, who'd been quietly coloring with the crayons Sophie had shared, looked up from his drawing. "Are you going to live with us now?" "I don't know yet, buddy. That depends on your mom and dad." "I think you should," Tyler announced with the certainty of someone who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with good intentions. "We have a couch." Frank's smile was the first genuine expression Jessica had seen from him all day. "Thank you. That's very generous." "Tyler," Sophie said with the patient tone of an older sister, "you can't just invite people to live with us. It's more complicated than that." "Why?" The question sparked a family discussion that revealed more about their dysfunction than any therapy session could have. Sophie explained, with the wisdom of someone forced to become an adult too early, that some grown-ups needed time to figure out if they liked each other. Tyler argued that liking people was easy, you just had to be nice to them. Michael contributed the observation that sometimes nice wasn't enough, and Jessica found herself defending her father to her own children despite her lingering resentment. By afternoon, an uneasy truce had been established. Frank would stay for a few days, sleeping on the couch and helping with immediate financial emergencies, while everyone decided how to navigate this unexpected reunion. He'd already made calls about the car payment and arranged to cover Tyler's daycare fees for the month. But even as their most pressing financial problems were being addressed, Jessica felt a different kind of anxiety building. The relief of having help was overshadowed by the fear of becoming dependent on yet another person's generosity. She traded one financial benefactor for another, and the weight of obligation felt just as heavy regardless of its source. Meanwhile, across town, Editha sat in her own kitchen, unaware that her former role as family savior had been transferred to someone else. She was reading a book, something she hadn't had time for in years, when her phone rang. Betty's voice carried the particular tone of someone bearing complicated news. "Editha, honey, I just saw Frank Williams at the bank, Jessica's father. He was asking about wire transfers and cashier's checks. Seemed to be handling some significant transactions." Editha closed her book carefully, processing this information. "How significant?" "Significant enough that the bank manager came out to personally handle his business. And he was asking about properties in the area. Rentals, specifically." The implications settled over Editha like a heavy blanket. Frank's arrival meant her financial withdrawal hadn't created the crisis she'd expected. Instead of forcing Michael and Jessica to confront their dependency, she'd simply triggered the arrival of a different enabler. "Well," she said quietly, "that's interesting. Are you okay with this?" Editha considered the question. Was she okay with Frank Williams stepping into the role she'd vacated? Did it matter that her son's family had found another source of financial rescue? "I suppose we'll see what happens next," she said finally. But as she hung up the phone, Editha realized that Frank's arrival had created a new dynamic she hadn't anticipated. The question was no longer whether Michael and Jessica could survive without her support. The question was whether they could learn to respect the support they received, regardless of its source, and whether Frank Williams was prepared for the particular brand of entitlement he'd just inherited. Dr. Linda Thompson's office felt like a carefully curated sanctuary designed to make difficult conversations feel less threatening. Soft gray walls, strategically placed tissues, and chairs arranged in a circle that suggested equality rather than authority. But despite the soothing environment, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with the proverbial knife. Jessica sat with her arms crossed, her body language broadcasting resistance from across the small space. Michael fidgeted with his phone, checking it obsessively as if expecting a work emergency that might excuse him from the hour ahead. Frank occupied his chair with the stillness of someone who'd learned to be comfortable with uncomfortable truths. And at the center of this reluctant gathering sat Dr. Thompson herself, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and the particular brand of professional calm that came from years of navigating family dysfunction. "I want to start," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone accustomed to guiding resistant participants, "by acknowledging that being here takes courage. Family therapy, especially around financial issues, requires people to examine patterns they might prefer to leave unexamined. We're only here because Sophie asked why we can't all just love each other anymore," Jessica said, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended. "This wasn't exactly our first choice for how to spend a Thursday afternoon." Dr. Thompson smiled, unfazed by the hostility. "Children often see family dynamics more clearly than adults do. Sophie's question suggests she's noticed something important about how your family functions." "She's 7, Jessica replied. "She doesn't understand the complexities." "What complexities?" The question was gentle but direct. "Help me understand what Sophie is missing." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing she didn't have a ready answer that didn't sound defensive. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple. There are financial realities, employment challenges, family obligations." "Let's talk about those family obligations," Dr. Thompson said, making a note on her tablet. "Frank, you've recently re-entered Jessica's life after a significant absence. What brought you back?" Frank met her gaze directly. "My daughter called me, desperate for help. Her family was facing eviction, utility shutoffs, the works. And I realized that my absence, my choice to leave when she was 12, had contributed to the patterns that led to that desperation." "What patterns?" "The belief that family members exist to solve your problems, that love means never having to face the consequences of your choices, that someone else will always be there to catch you when you fall." Jessica's face flushed red. "That's not fair. We didn't have choices. Michael's work is unpredictable. I can't work full-time with 2 kids, and expenses just keep mounting." "Jessica," Dr. Thompson interrupted gently, "I notice that your response focuses on external circumstances. What about the choices you did have? The choices about how to respond to those circumstances?" "Like what?" "Like the choice to live within your means. The choice to express gratitude for help received. The choice to develop financial independence rather than depending on others." The room fell silent. Even Michael stopped checking his phone, the weight of Dr. Thompson's observations settling over them like a heavy blanket. "We tried to be independent," Michael said finally. "But when I lost my full-time job during the pandemic, and the freelance work wasn't consistent enough, you turned to your mother for support. Temporarily. It was supposed to be temporary." 5 years, Dr. Thompson said, consulting her notes. "Nearly $200,000. At what point does temporary become a lifestyle?" Michael winced as if she'd slapped him. "We always intended to pay her back." "With what income? And how did you express appreciation for this support while you were receiving it?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice small and defensive. "She never said she minded. She offered to help." "She offered? Or you accepted her offers to avoid saying no?" Another painful silence. Dr. Thompson set down her tablet and leaned forward slightly. "I want to try an exercise. I'm going to ask each of you to describe the same situation from a different perspective. Jessica, I want you to imagine you're 68 years old, recently widowed, and you've been supporting your adult child's family for 5 years. How might you feel? I don't see the point. Humor me? Jessica closed her eyes, clearly struggling with the role reversal. I guess I might feel taken for granted, like my own needs didn't matter. And Michael, imagine you're 7 years old, watching your parents constantly stressed about money, seeing family members argue about financial support. What might you learn about love and family? Michael's face went pale. That love depends on what you can provide. That family means obligation, not choice. And Frank, imagine you're a child watching your father abandon the family when money gets tight. What might that teach you about how men handle responsibility? Frank's weathered face tightened. That when things get difficult, you run. That providing for family is optional, not essential. Dr. Thompson nodded. Now let's look at how these patterns might be repeating. Jessica, your father left when you were 12. How did that affect your relationship with money and security? Jessica's voice cracked slightly. I learned that you can't count on anyone. That you have to take what you can get when you can get it, because people leave. So when Editha offered financial support, I took it. I took it and I kept taking it because I was terrified it would stop. And when it did stop, I panicked. And Michael, growing up with financial security, how did that shape your relationship with money? I never really had to think about it. My parents handled everything. And then when I got married, Mom just continued handling things. I never learned to be financially responsible because someone else was always responsible for me. The admissions hung in the air like confessions. Dr. Thompson let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of recognition to settle. Frank, what do you see when you look at these patterns? I see the same mistakes I made, just in a different form. I abandoned my family when things got tough. They've abandoned their own responsibility by depending on others. The results are different, but the core problem is the same: avoiding the hard work of building something sustainable. Jessica's tears started slowly, then came in a rush. But we love our kids. We're not abandoning them. What does love look like to Sophie and Tyler? Dr. Thompson asked gently. Based on what they've observed in your family? Fighting about money, Michael said quietly. Adults being stressed and angry whenever bills come due. Grandparents disappearing when financial support stops. So if they grow up and face financial difficulties in their own marriages, what tools will they have? What models will they follow? The question hit the room like a bomb. Jessica doubled over in her chair, sobbing openly. Michael stared at his hands, the full weight of their dysfunction finally visible to him. Frank watched his daughter cry, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. This is why Sophie asked if you could all just love each other, Dr. Thompson continued. Because she's confused about why money seems to control whether family members care about each other. What do we do? Jessica asked through her tears. How do we fix this? First, you acknowledge that this isn't just about financial management. It's about learning to have relationships that aren't based on transaction. It's about developing the skills to be independent while still being connected to family. She pulled out a worksheet and handed copies to each of them. I want you to think about boundaries. What would healthy financial boundaries look like in your family? What would emotional boundaries look like? How can you support each other without enabling dependency? Michael looked at the worksheet as if it were written in a foreign language. I don't even know where to start. Start with honesty. Frank, what do you need from this relationship with Jessica and your grandchildren? I need to know that I'm helping them build something sustainable, not just postponing the inevitable crisis. I need to feel like my support is appreciated, not expected. And I need to know that my grandchildren are learning healthy patterns, not repeating the broken ones. Jessica, what do you need? I need to feel secure. I need to know that if something goes wrong, we won't lose everything. But I also need to know that I'm capable of handling problems without always calling for rescue. Michael, I need to feel like a man who can provide for his family. I need to stop being afraid of responsibility and start building something we can count on. Dr. Thompson made notes as they spoke. These are all legitimate needs. The question is how to meet them in ways that build strength rather than dependency. She handed them another sheet. Homework. Each of you is going to work on one specific area over the next week. Frank, I want you to set clear boundaries around your financial support. Specific amounts, specific purposes, specific timelines. Jessica, I want you to write a letter to Editha, not to send, but to process your feelings about how that relationship deteriorated. Michael, I want you to spend 30 minutes every day actively job searching. Not just checking listings, but making calls, sending emails, networking. That's it? Jessica asked. We just do homework and everything gets better? This is the beginning of a process that will take months, maybe years. Changing family patterns requires consistent effort and the willingness to be uncomfortable while you learn new ways of relating to each other. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Thompson addressed them as a group. I want you to remember that the crisis that brought you here isn't the real problem. The real problem is that your family has been operating on unsustainable patterns for years. The crisis was just the moment when those patterns finally broke down. So ATT was right to cut us off? Michael asked. Editha made a choice to protect herself and to stop enabling dependency. Whether that was right or wrong isn't the issue. The issue is what you do now to build healthier relationships moving forward. Outside the office, the three of them stood in the parking lot, each processing the hour in their own way. The California sun felt too bright after the controlled environment of therapy, and the normal world seemed strangely surreal. That was harder than I expected, Frank said finally. I feel like I've been hit by a truck, Jessica admitted. Michael looked at his phone, then deliberately put it away without checking it. Sophie's getting out of school in an hour. Maybe we should pick her up together, as a family. What are we going to tell her about therapy? Jessica asked. The truth, Frank said, that we're learning how to love each other better. As they drove toward the elementary school, each of them carried the weight of recognition. The understanding that the work ahead would be harder than accepting financial help, harder than writing checks, harder than any crisis they'd faced so far. But for the first time since this entire ordeal began, they also carried something else. Hope that honest work might lead to honest relationships, and that their children might learn different patterns than the ones that had brought them to this point. The real work was just beginning. The Unraveling, Part 8, Individual Journeys. The letter to Editha began on Tuesday and wasn't finished until Friday. Jessica sat at her kitchen table each morning after the children left for school, staring at blank paper like it might reveal the words she couldn't find. How do you apologize for 5 years of taking someone for granted? How do you explain entitlement so complete that gratitude never occurred to you? Dear Editha, she wrote for the 7th time. I don't know how to say I'm sorry for something I didn't even realize I was doing until it was too late. 3 pages later, her hand cramping from the unfamiliar act of writing by hand, Jessica understood why Dr. Thompson had assigned this exercise. With each sentence, she was forced to confront not just what she'd done, but why she'd done it. The fear beneath the entitlement. The desperation masked as demands. I called you useless because I felt useless, she wrote. Because without your money, I couldn't even keep my children's lights on. Meanwhile, Michael had transformed their spare bedroom into a makeshift office, complete with a schedule taped to the wall and a spreadsheet tracking his daily job search activities. 30 minutes had become an hour, then 2, as he discovered that actively pursuing work felt different than passively hoping for it. On Wednesday, he called 3 local marketing firms instead of just browsing their websites. On Thursday, he reached out to former colleagues who might know of openings. Friday brought his first real lead in months, a potential full-time position at a startup downtown. They want to interview me next week, he told Jessica that evening, his voice carrying a cautious excitement she hadn't heard in years. That's wonderful, she said, and meant it. But underneath her enthusiasm was a flutter of anxiety. What if he got the job? What if he didn't? They'd been crisis managing for so long that the possibility of stability felt almost foreign. Frank's homework proved equally challenging. Setting boundaries around money meant confronting his own impulses to fix everything immediately. Dr. Thompson had helped him understand that his rescue mission could easily become another form of enabling if he wasn't careful. He opened a separate account and deposited exactly $2,000 into it. That money would cover true emergencies, medical bills, urgent car repairs, genuine crises. Everything else Michael and Jessica would need to handle themselves. What if they can't make the mortgage next month? he asked Dr. Thompson during his individual session. What would happen if they couldn't make it? They'd lose the house. And then? Frank stared at her, realizing he'd never thought past the immediate crisis. They'd have to find something they could afford, which might be exactly what they need to learn to do. The concept felt revolutionary and terrifying in equal measure, but it was Editha's journey that proved most surprising, even to herself. Betty had mentioned the Golden Years Senior Center was looking for volunteers to help with their financial literacy program, teaching older adults about budgeting and avoiding scams. I don't know, Editha said when Betty first suggested it. I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach anyone about money management. Honey, you managed a school office budget for 30 years and kept track of every penny. Plus, you've learned firsthand about financial manipulation. Who better to help other people recognize it? The first class was small, 8 seniors, mostly women, who'd gathered in the center's community room with the nervous energy of students on the first day of school. Editha had prepared a simple presentation about budgeting basics, but found herself telling a different story entirely. 3 months ago, she began, I was supporting my son's family to the tune of $4,000 a month. I thought I was helping. It took me 5 years to realize I was enabling financial irresponsibility and teaching my grandchildren that love comes with a price tag. The room was silent, but engaged. These were people who understood family complications, who'd navigated their own relationships with adult children and financial expectations. How did you stop? Asked Margaret, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s whose own daughter had been borrowing money for years. I learned to value myself enough to say no. That simple statement triggered an hour-long discussion about boundaries, self-worth, and the difference between helping and enabling. Editha found herself energized in a way she hadn't experienced since retiring from the school district. After the class, Margaret approached her privately. Would you be willing to meet with me and my daughter? I think we need someone like you to help us have some difficult conversations. Driving home, Editha felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purposeful. Not needed in the way that drained her resources and energy, but valued for her wisdom and experience. Sophie's essay about families arrived that same week, assigned by her second-grade teacher as part of a unit on community. Jessica found it in Sophie's backpack on Friday evening, written in careful 7-year-old script. My Family by Editha Jones. Families are supposed to love each other, but sometimes they forget how. My family used to fight about money a lot. Mommy and Daddy were always worried, and Grandma Editha went away because people weren't nice to her. But now we are learning to be a better family. Daddy is looking for a job every day, and Mommy is learning to say thank you more. Grandpa Frank came to help us, but he says help is different from fixing everything. I think families are like plants. They need the right things to grow, but if you give them too much water, they get sick. People need help sometimes, but not too much help, or they don't learn to be strong. I miss Grandma Editha, but I think she is learning to be strong too. Maybe someday we will all be strong together. Jessica read the essay 3 times, tears blurring her vision. Her 7-year-old had understood something it had taken the adults months of therapy to grasp. That evening, after the children were asleep, the 3 adults sat in the living room reviewing their individual progress. Frank showed them his boundary-setting exercise, explaining the emergency fund and its limitations. Michael shared his job search spreadsheet and the upcoming interview. Jessica read portions of her letter to Editha aloud, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. Sophie wrote something at school, Jessica said finally, handing them the essay. They read it in silence, each recognizing their own journey reflected in a child's simple wisdom. She's right about the plant analogy, Frank said quietly. Too much help kills growth. Do you think? Michael hesitated, then continued. Do you think there's a chance Mom might be willing to rebuild some kind of relationship? Not financial, he added quickly. Just family. That's not up to us, Jessica said, though her tone was thoughtful rather than bitter. That's up to her. And honestly, after everything we put her through, she'd have every right to say no. But we can change, Frank said. We can become the kind of family she might actually want to be part of. As they talked, Each of them began to understand that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something entirely new, relationships based on respect rather than need, love that didn't require transaction, family bonds strong enough to weather conflict without dissolving. The work was far from over, but they'd taken the first steps toward becoming people worthy of each other's trust. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as Michael was preparing for his second interview at the downtown startup. Sophie's school nurse, her voice carrying the particular urgency that every parent dreaded hearing. "Mr. Jones? Sophie had an accident on the playground. We think her arm might be broken." The words hit Michael like ice water. His first instinct, ingrained after 5 years of financial dependency, was to call his mother. His fingers had actually dialed the first 3 digits of Editha's number before he stopped himself, staring at his phone as if it had betrayed him. Sophie needed him. His daughter was hurt, scared, sitting in a school nurse's office waiting for her father to fix the problem. And his immediate response had been to pass that responsibility to someone else. He hung up without completing the call and grabbed his car keys. At the emergency room, Sophie sat on the examination table with her left arm cradled against her chest, her face pale but determined not to cry. The sight of her trying to be brave broke something open in Michael's chest. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, sitting beside her carefully. "How are you feeling?" "It hurts," she admitted quietly. "But I didn't cry at school." "It's okay to cry when you're hurt, Sophie. Even grown-ups cry when they're hurt." The X-rays confirmed a clean break in her radius, not serious but requiring a cast and follow-up care. As the doctor explained the treatment plan, Michael found himself calculating costs automatically. Emergency room visit, X-rays, orthopedic follow-up, the cast itself. Even with insurance, they were looking at several $100s in out-of-pocket expenses, money they didn't have. In the old pattern, this would have triggered an immediate call to Editha. Emergency funds would have appeared in their account within hours, along with offers to pay for whatever additional care Sophie needed. The crisis would have been solved with a phone call and a bank transfer. But as Michael sat holding his daughter's good hand, he realized something had fundamentally changed. The thought of calling his mother for money didn't bring relief. It brought shame, the kind of shame that came from recognizing you'd become someone you didn't want to be. Instead, he called Jessica. "How bad is it?" Her voice was tight with worry. "Clean break, cast for 6 weeks. She's being so brave." "What about—" Jessica's question trailed off, but Michael knew what she was asking. "I don't know. We'll figure it out. For the first time in their marriage, we'll figure it out." Felt like a promise, rather than wishful thinking. That evening, after Sophie was settled at home with her bright purple cast and a collection of get-well drawings from Tyler, the adults gathered around the kitchen table for what felt like a war council. "The insurance covers 80%, Michael said, consulting the paperwork from the hospital. "Our portion is $347, plus whatever the orthopedist charges for follow-up visits." Frank reached for his wallet automatically, then stopped himself. His emergency fund was designed for exactly this kind of situation, but something about Michael's tone suggested this was a test, not just of their new boundaries, but of their commitment to building something sustainable. "What are our options?" Frank asked, instead of offering immediate rescue. Michael spread their budget notes across the table, a financial picture that had become painfully clear over the past month of careful tracking. "We can put it on the credit card and make payments, or I can see if the hospital offers payment plans." "What about the interview this week?" Jessica asked. "If you get that position, then we'll have steady income starting next month." "But that doesn't help us with this week's problem." The conversation continued for an hour, each of them wrestling with the urge to take the easy path. Frank's money could solve the immediate crisis. Jessica could ask for extra hours at the dental office. Michael could delay pursuing the full-time position to focus on immediate freelance income. But every easy solution felt like a step backward, a return to the patterns they'd been working so hard to change. Finally, Sophie appeared at the kitchen doorway, drawn by the serious adult conversation. Her cast was already decorated with Tyler's colorful marker drawings, transforming the medical necessity into something almost festive. "Are you talking about money again?" she asked with the directness that had become her trademark. The adults exchanged glances, recognizing the moment for what it was, another test of their commitment to honesty and health. "We're talking about how to pay for your doctor visit, sweetheart," Jessica said carefully. "It costs money, and we're trying to figure out the best way to handle it." "Is it a lot of money?" "It's money we don't have right now," Michael admitted. "But we're going to figure out a way to manage it ourselves." Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned to think about family finances far too early in life. "Does that mean you're not going to call Grandma Editha?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. All three adults felt the weight of Sophie's expectation, her hope that they might finally prove capable of handling their own problems. "No, sweetheart," Michael said firmly. "We're not going to call Grandma Editha. This is our responsibility." Sophie smiled, the first genuine smile any of them had seen from her in weeks. "Good. I think she would be proud of you for that." 2 days later, the test became even more challenging. Michael's interview went well. Better than well, but the startup wouldn't be making hiring decisions for another 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Jessica's hours at the dental office were cut due to a scheduling conflict, reducing their already tight income by 40%. The pressure mounted like steam in a covered pot. Bills arrived with clockwork regularity. Tyler developed a fever that required a pediatrician visit. The car made an alarming grinding noise that suggested expensive repairs in the near future. Everything that could go wrong seemed determined to go wrong simultaneously. It was Jessica who cracked first. "This is insane," she said Thursday evening, after another day of financial Jenga, moving money between accounts, delaying payments, calculating and recalculating their shrinking resources. "Frank, you have money sitting right there. Sophie needs follow-up care, Tyler needs medicine, and we're playing some kind of philosophical game while our kids suffer." "Are they suffering?" Frank asked gently. "Or are we suffering because we're finally taking responsibility for our own choices? Sophie has a broken arm, which we're handling. You scheduled her follow-up appointment." Michael researched payment plan options. Tyler saw the pediatrician and got his medicine. Everyone's needs are being met. Barely. But they are being met. By you. By your own efforts, and planning, and hard work. Jessica stared at him, recognizing the truth in his words but resenting the difficulty of it. "It would be so much easier if I just, what? Stepped into the role your mother-in-law vacated? Enabled you to continue avoiding responsibility for your own financial life?" The words were spoken kindly, but they landed like physical blows. Jessica's face flushed with anger and shame in equal measure. "I hate this," she whispered. "I hate feeling powerless and scared and like everything might fall apart at any moment." "That feeling," Frank said quietly, "is what adulthood actually feels like. It's what I was running from when I left you and your mother. It's what you've been running from by depending on other people's money to solve your problems. But what if we can't handle it? What if something happens that we genuinely can't manage? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But so far, everything that's come up you've handled. Not perfectly, not easily, but you've handled it." That weekend, something shifted. Michael got a call from the startup. They wanted to offer him the position, starting Monday at a salary that would finally make their budget work without external support. Jessica picked up 2 additional shifts at the dental office, covering for a colleague who was out sick. Sophie's follow-up appointment went perfectly, with the doctor praising her healing progress. Small victories, but they added up to something larger. Proof that they were capable of managing their own lives. Sunday evening, as they celebrated Michael's new job with takeout pizza, paid for with money they'd earned themselves, Sophie made an announcement. "I want to call Grandma Editha." The adults froze, pizza slices halfway to their mouths. "What would you like to tell her, sweetheart?" Jessica asked carefully. "I want to tell her about my cast, and about Daddy's new job. And that we're learning to be the kind of family she might want to visit again." Jessica and Michael looked at each other, years of conflict and therapy and growth passing between them in a single glance. "Would you like us to call her together?" Michael asked. Sophie nodded solemnly. "I think she would like to know that we're okay, and that we're sorry." and that we love her even when we don't need her money. As Jessica reached for the phone, her hands trembling slightly, she realized that Sophie had articulated something none of the adults had been able to express. Love without transaction, family without financial obligation, relationship based on choice rather than need. Whether Editha would be ready to hear that message remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, they were ready to offer it, not because they needed something from her, but because they had something to give. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When Editha's familiar voice answered, Jessica took a deep breath and began with the words she should have said years ago. "Editha, it's Jessica. We just wanted to call and tell you that we love you, and to say thank you for everything you've done for us, and to ask, would you like to hear about Sophie's purple cast?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. But when Editha finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth that none of them had heard in months. "I would love to hear about Sophie's cast." And for the first time since this entire crisis began, the Jones family gathered around the phone not to ask for help, but simply to share their lives with someone they loved. It felt like the beginning of something entirely new. 6 months after the phone call that changed everything, Editha Jones stood in her kitchen arranging flowers in a vase she hadn't used since Robert's funeral. Pink roses from her garden, the ones she and Robert had planted their first spring in California, mixed with white carnations from the grocery store. Simple, unpretentious, beautiful. Today was Sophie's 8th birthday party, the first family gathering since the crisis that had torn them apart and, ultimately, forced them to rebuild something stronger. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, written in Sophie's careful cursive. "Please come to my birthday party, Grandma Editha. We miss you and love you and want to celebrate with you. Love, Sophie." At the bottom, in Jessica's handwriting, "We understand if you're not ready, but we hope you are." Editha had called Dr. Thompson before responding, not for permission, but for perspective. Their own sessions over the past months had helped her understand her role in the family's dysfunction, her enabling disguised as love, her worth measured by what she could provide rather than who she was. "What do you want from this relationship?" Dr. Thompson had asked. "I want to be Sophie and Tyler's grandmother, not their ATM, not their safety net, just their grandmother. And if they revert to old patterns, if there's pressure for financial support, then I'll leave again. But this time it won't be about anger or hurt feelings. It will be about maintaining healthy boundaries." Now, as she checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, Editha felt nervous in a way she hadn't experienced since her first day at Lincoln Elementary 40 years ago. She wore a new dress, navy blue with small white flowers, purchased with money she'd once have automatically transferred to Michael's account. Small acts of self-care had become revolutionary after years of self-denial. The drive to Michael's house took her through familiar neighborhoods that felt different now. 6 months of therapy, volunteer work, and rediscovering her own interests had changed her perspective on everything, including the suburban streets where she'd spent so many years rushing to solve other people's problems. Michael's house looked different too. The lawn was neatly maintained, the flower beds weeded, the mailbox free of the overflowing bills that had once spilled onto the ground. Small changes that spoke to larger shifts in how the family managed their responsibilities. She parked behind Frank's pickup truck, noting its presence without the anxiety that another person's involvement might have once triggered. Through therapy, she'd learned that Frank's relationship with his daughter and grandchildren didn't diminish her own potential relationship with them. Love, she'd discovered, wasn't a finite resource that had to be rationed. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing Sophie in a yellow sundress with her left arm still sporting the purple cast that had become a badge of honor. Her face lit up with pure joy at seeing Editha. "Grandma, you came!" The hug was fierce and uncomplicated, the kind of embrace that reminded Editha why she'd risked this reunion despite her lingering uncertainties. This connection with her granddaughter was worth navigating whatever awkwardness lay ahead. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. You look beautiful." "Thank you. Come see my decorations. I helped Mommy make them myself." The living room had been transformed with homemade streamers and hand-drawn banners that proclaimed Sophie's 8th birthday in rainbow letters. Nothing elaborate or expensive, but everything chosen and created with care. The difference from previous parties, catered affairs that Editha had funded without thought, was stark and somehow more meaningful. Tyler barreled into the room, his 4-year-old enthusiasm undiminished by the months of family upheaval. "Grandma Editha, look, I made you a picture!" He thrust a crayon drawing toward her. Stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun, labeled in wobbly letters, "My family." She counted the figures. 7 people, including herself, standing together in a line that suggested connection without dependency. "It's beautiful, Tyler. May I keep it?" His vigorous nodding made her smile. Some things, she realized, hadn't changed. Tyler was still Tyler. Energetic, affectionate, delighted by small attentions. But he was also calmer somehow. Less frantic, as if the household's new stability had settled into his bones. Jessica appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel and wearing an expression of cautious hope. The months had changed her too. She looked tired but healthier, more grounded, as if she'd finally stopped running from problems long enough to actually solve them. "Editha, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me." They studied each other across the living room, 2 women who'd hurt each other and were tentatively exploring whether healing was possible. Jessica's voice, when she spoke again, carried a humility that hadn't been there before. "I wrote you a letter, months ago in therapy. I never sent it, but I'd like you to read it sometime, if you want to." "I'd like that." Michael emerged from the backyard, followed by Frank, both carrying folding chairs from what appeared to be an ongoing setup operation. Michael's face when he saw his mother was complex. Joy mixed with guilt, hope tempered by uncertainty. "Mom." He set down the chairs and approached her carefully, as if she might bolt at any sudden movement. "I'm glad you're here. So am I." The hug they shared was tentative but genuine, the first physical contact they'd had since the day she'd walked out of this house 6 months ago. When they separated, Michael's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I got the job," he said quietly. "Full-time, with benefits. We're managing everything ourselves now." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Editha felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Not the satisfaction of being needed, but the deeper joy of witnessing genuine growth. "I'm proud of you, Michael." Frank approached with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate complex family dynamics through hard-won experience. "Editha, good to see you again." "Frank." She studied Jessica's father, seeing in his weathered face the peace that came from facing your failures and working to do better. "Thank you for stepping in when they needed help. Thank you for stepping back when they needed to learn." The simple exchange carried weight that the children couldn't understand, but the adults felt deeply. 2 people who'd loved the same family in different ways, acknowledging the difficult choices that had led to healing. The party itself was a revelation. Simple games in the backyard, cake made from scratch by Jessica with Sophie's help, presents that were thoughtful rather than expensive. Tyler's gift to his sister was a handmade coupon book offering services like 1 free hug and help with homework, and sharing my toys for 1 whole day. Sophie's delight was genuine and infectious. But it was the photograph that became the day's most significant moment. After cake, as the afternoon light began to soften, Sophie announced that she wanted a family picture. Not the formal, posed shots that had marked previous celebrations, but something casual and real. They gathered on the back porch, all 7 figures from Tyler's drawing come to life. Editha found herself between her grandchildren, with Michael and Jessica flanking the group, and Frank holding the camera with a timer function. As they arranged themselves, laughing at Tyler's insistence that everyone say cheese in funny voices, Editha realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in years, she was part of a family photograph, not because she was funding the family, but because she belonged in it. When the timer finally clicked, capturing their laughter and genuine affection, Sophie turned to Editha with shining eyes. "Now we're all together again. But different. Better." "How are we better, sweetheart?" Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Because now we love each other because we want to, not because we have to. And because everyone takes care of themselves. so we can take care of each other the right way. The wisdom of an 8-year-old, distilling months of therapy and growth into a simple truth that the adults were still learning to live. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Editha found herself alone with Jessica in the kitchen, both women washing dishes with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd done this task together many times before. "I owe you an apology," Jessica said quietly, not looking up from the plate she was scrubbing. "Not just for that day when I called you useless, but for years of taking you for granted. For treating your generosity like it was owed to us." "I owe you an apology too," Editha replied, "for enabling dependency instead of encouraging growth, for making my worth depend on what I could provide instead of who I was." They worked in silence for a while, the weight of acknowledgement settling between them like a bridge being built, one honest word at a time. "What happens now?" Jessica asked eventually. "Now we practice. We practice being a family that chooses to love each other instead of needing each other. We practice gratitude and boundaries and honest communication. Some days we'll do it well, some days we won't. And if we mess up," Editha smiled, thinking of Dr. Thompson's patient wisdom and the months of difficult growth that had brought them to this point, "then we'll work through it. Together. Like families do." As she drove home that evening, Editha's car filled with leftover birthday cake and Tyler's drawing carefully placed on the passenger seat, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The crisis that had felt like an ending had become a beginning. The family that had nearly destroyed itself through toxic patterns had rebuilt itself on healthier foundations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie, sent with Jessica's help. "Thank you for coming to my party, Grandma. I love you." Editha pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment, reading the message again. Such simple words, but they carried the weight of everything that had changed. Love freely given, freely received, with no transaction required. She looked at her house. Robert's house, their house, now fully hers to enjoy without the burden of supporting other people's financial irresponsibility. The garden bloomed in the evening light, tended by her own hands and watered by systems that worked because they were properly maintained. Tomorrow she would return to her volunteer work at the senior center, helping other families navigate the difficult balance between support and enabling. Next week she had lunch plans with Betty and a new book club to attend. Her calendar was full of activities she'd chosen for herself, relationships she was building because they brought her joy, rather than because they needed her resources. But tonight she would sit in her peaceful kitchen and display Tyler's drawing on her refrigerator, right next to the birthday party photograph that showed 7 people who'd learned that the strongest families aren't held together by money or obligation, but by the conscious daily choice to love and support each other in healthy ways. 6 months ago, Editha Jones had been a woman whose worth was measured by what she could provide. Tonight, she was simply Sophie and Tyler's grandmother, Michael's mother, and a woman who'd finally learned to love herself enough to demand respect from others. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every difficult step. Outside her window, the automatic sprinklers whispered to life, nurturing the garden she and Robert had planted with patient hands and hopeful hearts. Some things, she'd learned, were worth the wait. Some things grew stronger when they learned to flourish on their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,